And I think with Hegel, you can give up. I mean, I'm going on a lot with the German idealists, maybe, but I hope the kind of basic premise is there that they are great thinkers of contradiction in the same way. And this is the contradiction, that the functional contradictions that exist in psychoanalysis and in neuroscience, if you know what to do with it, I think. And I say this as a non-neuroscientist myself. I say this as a reader of neuroscience, who I think, because I have an outside perspective, perhaps I'm not, perhaps I'm naive, perhaps I'm an idiot, but perhaps I'm as Tucker Carlson called, Putin called Tucker Carlson a useful idiot in this sense.
Well,
In
you're not a total idiot, to quote Zizek, because you do in fact give an example here. I mean, you've done your homework, so to speak.
mm,
You talk about the apropos contradictions, and let's just even call it the gap of subjectivity in the paper, the failed interventions of psychoanalysis. I'll read the whole title: Psychoanalysis and Neuroscience as a Proxy Intervention to Psychoanalysis and Philosophy. You even talk about the executive function in the brain, and how there's this contingency built into it, much like when we see it in psychoanalysis and even German idealism. But yeah, I can certainly. So I guess first of all, I wasn't expecting you to talk about Kant's third critique. Firstly, I haven't read it, so I can't say much. I've just read like footnotes on it or just like summaries of it.
mm,
But I find it so interesting that you connected this question of, perhaps I shouldn't be surprised by this, that you connected this question of contradictions and antagonisms to him talking about the sublime in the third critique. That was beautiful. There was a lot there. One other question which I had, and frankly, at first I felt bad to even ask you this, because I was like, how in the world can I just ask you this in a very crude way and expect you to like come up with an answer out of nowhere? But I feel like from the answers you've given so far, you've given me carte blanche to ask you anything, really. So again, for
yes,
a
please, please.
neuroscientist, or this type of person who's coming more from like a scientific mode of viewing either the brain as being the locus of all of our being and our experience, or even thinking of subjectivity in like a very positivistic sense, who not just people in the sciences, but even I spoke to Graham Harman, and I adore Professor Graham Harman. I mean, I really enjoy reading his work, and he's a fantastic philosopher. But ultimately, I disagree with him because I am a, broadly speaking, a subject oriented thinker.
Mm,
And for him, even like when I asked him about the surplus in the subject in the Lacanian sense, he kind of started talking about consciousness. But for me, from the reading I've done, when German Idealists or even Lacanians talk about the subject, they don't mean consciousness. It's something, in fact, rather, it's almost like a form or a structure, something very formal in a way. But yeah, so
yes,
if I could ask
for
you,
Lacanian, the subject is
Rafael, yeah, please go ahead.
no,
What
sorry,
is the
just a brief,
subject?
brief. The subject is like where consciousness isn't. Like the subject
Yeah,
of Lacan is
he
the
plays with
unconscious.
Descartes' line even. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Sorry, let carry on. I just wanted to. Yes, sorry.
No. You. That's kind of what I wanted to ask from you. Like, I mean, maybe take the Lacanian psychoanalytic angle, but even the German idealist angle, if possible. If someone could just ask you what is a subject, how would you kind of articulate that?
Mm. I mean, I think that the subject is, and I think it's where Graham Harman has troubles here, because, and I think this is the irony with Graham Harman. I totally respect his work. I think he's a very, very, very interesting thinker. He generally is unbelievably good at sort of just summarizing movements very well in philosophy. Um, I always get the suspicion that he simply just isn't very interested in the subject. Like that he's just not, he just doesn't find it that fascinating. He said, what about objects? Which yeah, fine. The more, which I'm like, okay, but this can coexist with subject-oriented philosophy. It's just another guy who says, well, objects are also interesting. Yeah, sure. The more scathing attack is by Quentin Meillassoux, He's the truly scathing attack on subject-oriented philosophy.
Mm.
And yet Meillassoux is, to me, an extremely interesting reader of Hegel. So eventually even he goes like, this was a fun attack on correlationism, but sure, like, and I think even he knows that Hegel can account for the problems of geology, etc. Anyway, relating to the subject, yes, the subject is, if anything, it's where consciousness is not. Animals can be very conscious. I've seen them. We have, and I truly not beyond the, because this is also what Mark Solms often does when he speaks about consciousness, where he says that you begin with like just sensibility on a certain sense, like sentience, etc., and then you get higher consciousness. But he never really goes into the higher consciousness part, in my opinion. Like, he'll mention it, but he really, when the like surface is removed, he's talking about um, about sensuality and things like this, uh, but anyway, the point is, I mean, I've noticed with animals, when I say consciousness, I mean like reflective, speculative consciousness. I believe animals have it completely. I'm not a Cartesian in that sense. I believe that the distinction, and I think this is Lacan's main point, the subject emerges with an unconscious. What we have is, all animals have a consciousness. What humanity has is an unconscious, because the unconscious is what emerges as a consequence of, as an extension from consciousness, from language. It's you enter language and then suddenly you realize language produces effects it can't account for. This is my main problem with, and I'm going to butcher his name as well, but John Delaglio, who the
Galagdale,
Lacanian,
yep.
the Lacanian neuroscientist, because he begins a lot and says like, well, what's interesting about the mind is like what is in nature and yet in excess of nature. Like, what does nature produce that nature then can't assimilate to? In the same way, what does the brain produce that the brain then can't assimilate to, like assimilate or like incorporate it according to its own logic? And I think there's two things. Like, on the one hand, you can say like, there's always these. I remember reading the studies that said like the self or the I think is located here in like some anterior part of the frontal cortex, and this is where the self is. Like, when you think I am thinking, this part activates. Which then I think, from what I read, none of the studies were replicable. But even if they were, like, fine, there might be a part of the brain that's responsible for the registration that I'm thinking, but what part of the brain is responsible for the fact that I'm thinking of the fact that I'm thinking of the fact that I'm thinking of the fact that I'm thinking, ad absurdum? Like, you're asking a different question because it might be the same part of the brain, but thinking about the fact that you're thinking is different from thinking, or thinking, like, these are different things. So on the one hand, mind is permanently in excess of it. But not only this, but also the unconscious. I mean, the unconscious is the bit of the development of consciousness that consciousness then can't account for. And this is where Delaglio goes wrong, because he seems to then go, the unconscious is in the Lacanian sense, the real, the non-representable. And the non-representable is simply the intense, like the intensity, the kind of almost overwhelming intensities of basic, like, drive functions, or id functions, as he says, which are basically like the effective registrations of instincts, he argues, not my argument, because I think it's wrong. And then he says, so basically, in a certain sense, the id is the non-representable real, which is, and he says there's a dynamic exchange between neural circuits, but then he goes back and says it's basically in the upper brainstem, which to me is totally a mess, because we have to follow what Lacan and Laplanche actually say here. And what Lacan and Laplanche actually say is that not only the id, but the primary function, as it's called in psychoanalysis. So primary function is like basic primitive instincts. Secondary function is conscious, advanced cognitive functions, etc. And what the primary process in Lacan and Laplanche is something that, although it's primary, it comes after the secondary process. So you get first advanced rationality, cognition, consciousness, then you get the thing that's the exception to it. Then you get this kind of unheimlich, uncanny, unpleasant intimacy of an absolute otherness, some type of alien entity within this conscious processing, which is the unconscious. So the seemingly primitive primary process is in fact comes after it's installed as the exception to a pre-existing, more sophisticated secondary processing. This is totally missed by, I mean, Lacan insists on this. The real is not what pre-exists, it's the symbolic. The real is the thing produced by the symbolic that the symbolic itself can't account for. It's a contradiction at the heart of the symbolic. But if you remove the symbolic, you no longer have the real either, because it doesn't pre-exist it. Just like the id, and this is crucial for Lacan, the id is simply the counterpart of an obscene superego. Like, if you remove the strange performative customs of the external world, where you're expected to engage with certain performances that make no sense apart from simply perpetuate themselves, the id is the counterpart to this. It's simply the kind of vulgar obscenities nested within social practices that violent outrage can be justified in accord, if it's granted, if it's permitted by the other. That even, and like, to be very vulgar, even rape and murder have a cultural value. Like, not value as in like they're valuable, but they like their weight, their meaning is culturally inscribed. It's not naturally defined as being rape or murder. It's like it, and in fact sometimes it's culturally encouraged. So the point is, the id as the obscene primitive thing is in fact the logical counterpart to the advanced form of the superego. It's not what pre-exists and resists the superego. It's the kind of, to put it simply, like in a simple literary sense, it's simply the Mr. Hyde to the Jekyll of the superego. It's simply the logical extension of it. Like, the superego produces these extremely vulgar intensities that we fight off. So the id, and this is my problem with even the Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis, like, the id can't be simply something in the brainstem. The id has to be a top-down thing. Like, sometimes my brainstem might tell me, you just want to go to sleep, you're tired, you might have eaten a big meal, whatever, you might have walked around a lot in the day, worked hard, you want to go to sleep. My id is the expectation that, no, you should also go have some like wild orgies to show that you're living your life or something, or you should be sleeping with your partner or whatever. Like, this is a culturally inscribed logic, and the id sometimes, in fact often, the id, the Freudian and Lacanian id, directly contradicts our biological need. It directly opposes simple survivalist instincts. It is something where biology acts against itself. So anyway, that's a problem. But returning to the subject, I think the subject is this. It's a way to. It embodies, first of all, a certain lack or an absence, which is, I mean, the simple formula Lacan gives is that the subject is simply what is implied between one signifier and the next, or the one signifier and the chain of signifiers to which it belongs. But at the same time, really, the subject is, and this is my second big point, which is even truer for Mark Solms, the subject is simply a way of embodying failure. You fail to live up to what you want in childhood, well, then you get the social subject. You don't get the perfect harmony and union with mother, well, then you have the castrated subject that is a social subject, which has an unconscious implication. You don't get a pleasure, well, you learn to enjoy the absence of pleasure. You become a masochistic subject. All desire is masochistic in the Lacanian sense. So, like, the subject is simply a way of embodying failure. It's a way, like, you fail to do this, the subject is there to almost symbolize this failure as its own premise, its own form of enjoyment. And this is still the problem with, if you read Mark Solms, it's very, very clear. But even in Lacanian neuropsychoanalysts, which is that it still reduces pleasure to something on the level of need, of this this basic homeostatic argument that if you tend away from perfect biological harmony, you feel unpleasure, then you tend to walk back towards it, you feel pleasure. But this isn't, if there's one thing that psychoanalysis insists, it's that pleasure, and specifically enjoyment, is often directly opposed to your Darwinian biological self-interest. Why would you have fetishisms and masochistic, violent masochistic sexual desires if what you're really there for is to have the homeostatic need to drink water, reproduce, eat a meal? Why would you enjoy, almost on an ideological sense, yes, things like asceticism, but also like these strange sexual encounters where the goal of sexuality is postponed endlessly? Like the actual reason you have a sexual relation shows that is postponed. What you have is the continual reproduction of the absence of any sexual relation. You focus on the fetish object. So like human practices, generally ideological, sexual, personal practices, if they show anything, is that enjoyment rejects pleasure. It rejects the basic biological model of survival as pleasurable, homeostatic pleasure. And yet the neuropsychoanalysts insist on it. They tend to insist on, but here's again where you can play with it in a neuropsychoanalytic, in the neurological sense, which is that if the brain does anything, to me, it does many things, but if like memory, take memory for example, if we've seen one thing is that the memory structures of the brain, including the hippocampus, the neocortex, etc., are unfaithful to actual events. They constantly rework each other according to new subjective priorities. It's not creating a faithful representation of the world as it is. It's in fact reworking the world according to strange priorities. And often these priorities can, whatever it can be, they're often very far from survival. You remember a passing glance of a person that you saw on the subway one day, and then suddenly you're totally dissatisfied with any sexual relation. Like memory often can be very counterproductive. It can act against any faithful reproduction of reality and against the basic, survivalist drive: reproduce, have sex, whatever, eat, drink. Sometimes, your memory can be so counterintuitive, counterproductive, that it directly intervenes, like, against these things. And and this to me is, for example, where it should be going, which is to notice that there are these strange enigmas and paradoxes where for example, the basic premise of psychoanalysis that we're not natural, like we're not natural creatures, we're these strangely self-contradictory cultural avatars of failure, of perverse forms of enjoyment. Even the most intimate experience of the self, of my own personality, is conditioned or is guaranteed by the other. It's ideologically structured, etc. Like these are there's no natural experience and things like this. We're not natural creatures. And on the face of it, you'd think, oh, well, that throws neuroscience out the window because neuroscience looks at nature. No, because even neuroscience throws nature out of the window at a certain point, where it says that our memory is simulacral, it reconstructs itself. We operate against biological Darwinian survival. We have strange new priorities once we have a neocortex that directly have a top-down reconfiguration of the earlier, more natural, basic brain structures. So neuroscience itself could reach the same conclusion, that we're unnatural. Like the basic human project is unnatural. But instead, it's taken this strange tendency to go, no, pleasure is still, enjoyment is just a reflection of survival. But this clearly isn't the case for psychoanalysis, and my argument would be it's not the case for neuroscience anymore either. Or at least you could push it in that way. We have these strange top-down, perplexing paradoxes that the brain does, which are not faithful to our survival, to a faithful representation of reality. They introduce something different that I think can be used to argue that we're not natural creatures. Our enjoyment is in direct contradiction to pleasure, blah, 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 and so on. I mean, does that make some sense?
But also, as you mentioned in your piece, and I think I was going to ask you about this for you to flesh it out, but I feel like you've already at least intimated the arguments you made in your piece, the enjoyment of failure, a critique of Mark Solms, this Substack piece, where, of course, you talk about the death drive, and we know that, in fact, for me,
Sorry,
really, I
that's
get this
another
from.
point.
Please go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I
No,
get this point
sorry,
from
I'll let you finish, but that's the other point. The Lacanian neuroscientists don't respect the death drive. The death drive is its own thing, and that's very important, even for Lacan. Sorry, that was just a brief interruption.
No, that is in fact quite important, because I had a question on the death drive too. In fact, the last question, and what I was trying to get at here was this. Todd McGovern says one reason psychoanalysis will never really be truly integrated into an institution like a university or a clinic, in a way it has to always break down, is because, well, it speaks of the death drive, it speaks of the unconscious, and the unconscious is something really obscene and ugly, and you can't really institutionalize it like any other field, and that's kind of really what Freud discovered in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle.